They paid less for the girl than for the mule that brought her in, and before this story is over, that insult will shake an entire house, break a marriage bargain, and force one man to decide whether hidden tenderness is worth anything at all when spoken too late. It happened in New Spain in the year 1748 at a dying indigo hacienda in the Oaxaca Valley, where even the walls looked tired. The lime on the adobe had peeled in long, pale curls. The vats behind the worksheds held more stain than profit. Corn peons were already out before dawn every day, bent over the fields until the heat turned the air thick enough to drink. And into that place, one October afternoon, came a young woman of 22, with cracked feet, bleeding heels, and red dust caked all the way up her calves. Her name in this house would become Adela. The foreman, Gaspar Telles, held the chain fixed to her left wrist with the loose confidence of a man who had spent too many years mistaking power for character. He walked her across the road and through the gate as if he were delivering sacks of dye root or a broken tool that might still be made useful. She wore a faded yellow cloth over her hair. Her mouth was set hard from thirst. Her shoulders were straight in a way that did not belong to her condition. That was what the women in the back passage noticed first. She would not lower her eyes, not to the gate, not to the courtyard stones, not even when the shadows of the main house fell across her face and the servants drew back to make space. It was a small thing, if you have never lived under a roof ruled by rank. In a place like that, it was the one thing no one forgave. Women in bondage learned quickly to look at the floor. The floor was safety. The floor said, "I know what I am." But she kept her gaze level, calm, forward. And the calm in it troubled everyone more than open fear would have done. Under the broad laurel in the middle court sat Don Baltasar de Avendaño, 60 years old, his account book open across one knee, turning pages with thick fingers stained by ink and tobacco. He did not look at her face at first. He measured wrists, arms, back, endurance, usefulness. Gaspar named the price with a trader's pride. Don Baltasar gave a small grunt, then said, "Take her to Jacinta. She will learn washing, ironing, and table service." A beat later, almost as an afterthought, he added, "And remove the chain. She is not an animal." There was another man in that courtyard. His son, Tomas, 26, standing near the corridor in a dark wool coat too fine for the dust around him. He should have looked away. A wise man in that house would have done it without effort. But he looked. When Adela turned, just once, before crossing into the cool dark of the interior rooms, his eyes met hers long enough for something dangerous to begin. If you want me to keep telling you what that look cost them both, subscribe. Because by nightfall he still could not forget her face. After that glance in the courtyard, the house swallowed her. Gaspar passed her off to the rear wing with the impatience of a man done with delivery. The air changed as soon as she crossed the inner corridor. Outside, the late sun had smelled of dust, horse sweat, and dry leaves. Back there, everything smelled of wet cloth, lye soap, old ashes, and women who slept too many to a room. The domestic servants' quarters had no windows at all, only thick walls that held heat by day and gave back cold by night. Straw mats lay side by side on the floor. A cracked basin stood near the door. Someone had hung 2 faded skirts from a nail to dry, and they moved faintly in the draught like tired flags. The woman waiting for her was called Jacinta. She looked to be around 50, though even she would not have been able to name her exact age. Years in that place were not counted by birthdays. They were counted by harvests, by fever seasons, by burials, by how many times a mistress changed her temper and still expected breakfast at dawn. Jacinta had lived inside those walls for more than 20 years. Her hands showed it before her face did. The fingers had curled inward from decades of scrubbing, wringing, hauling pots, lifting irons, and pressing linen over steaming boards. The joints were swollen and hard. The skin across her knuckles had gone thick and smooth in places, split and shiny in others. She took one look at Adela's wrist where the chain had rubbed the flesh raw, and one look at her face, and saw too much too quickly. "Sit," she said. Adela sat on the edge of a stool. Another woman brought a rag dipped in cool water and wiped the blood from her heels. No one asked permission. No one offered pity, either. Pity was expensive in a house like that. Across the room, voices drifted in from the yard, where laundry slapped stone in steady rhythm. Somewhere farther off, in the dark before evening, a bell sounded from the little chapel by the road. Jacinta tied a strip of linen around Adela's left wrist, snug enough to protect the skin, gentle enough to feel strange. "Listen carefully," she said. "The women who last here learn fast. They rise before the family. They sleep after the cause die. They obey before a command is finished. And when a master speaks, they look down." Adela said nothing. Jacinta's eyes sharpened. "I heard what you did in the courtyard." For the first time since entering the back wing, Adela let her gaze move fully to the older woman's face. Her Spanish came slowly, each word selected with care from a mind that had carried more than one language across more than one shore. "I looked ahead," she said. A sound escaped one of the other women, halfway between fear and disbelief. Jacinta did not react at once. She only studied her, those worn hands resting in her lap like tools left out after hard labor. Then, very quietly, she asked the question no one else there would have dared to ask on the first day. "And what," Jacinta said, "did you bring with you, besides that courage?" Adela understood the question at once, though she took a moment before answering it. The women in the rear wing were listening without seeming to listen. One kept wringing out a cloth in the basin. Another pretended to sort aprons by the door. Jacinta sat very still, her bent hands folded over one another, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that the truth comes slower when it has crossed an ocean. Outside, the last light was fading from the yard. A mule snorted near the stable wall. Somewhere in the kitchen, a lid struck iron, and a cook cursed under her breath. "At night," Adela said carefully, "my mother sang while she braided my hair." The room softened, though nobody moved. Her Spanish came out in pieces, but clear enough. Some words still carried the shape of another tongue. Others had the rough edge of Portuguese, learned in fear and command. The rest she had picked up where she could, from docks, orders, and other captive mouths. Jacinta heard all of that immediately. Women like her became good at hearing what a person had survived before the person had strength enough to say it plainly. "What language?" Jacinta asked. Adela looked down then, though only to the floor between them, as if the answer itself had weight. "Yoruba." One of the younger servants crossed herself. Another drew a quick breath. The word meant nothing to them in any learned sense, but it sounded like distance, like a shore beyond maps, like the kind of place a priest mentioned only when speaking of souls and commerce in the same breath. Jacinta gave a slow nod. "And can you still sing?" Adela's fingers tightened over the rough linen of her skirt. "A little." "Good," the older woman said. "Keep it hidden." That answer surprised her more than the question had. Jacinta leaned back, and the stool creaked beneath her. "There are two ways to live in a house like this. One is to bend until you forget where the break happened. The other is to bend where they can see you, and keep one piece inside untouched. If you are wise, you will learn the second way faster than I learned the first." Then she lifted her hands. She did not do it for pity. She did it the way one lays a tool on the table and says, "Look well, this is what the work becomes." Her fingers had folded in on themselves from years of hot water, harsh soap, wet wool, iron handles, and endless weight. Even in the dim room, Adela could see the old swelling around the joints. "I was not always old," Jacinta said. "I was simply here too long." The words stayed hanging there with the smell of damp cloth and smoke. That night, Adela lay awake on the straw mat, listening to the breath of the other women and the faint scratching of mice inside the wall. Sleep would not come. The dark felt thick, close, almost warm against her face. Somewhere beyond the rear wing, out past the courtyard and the laurel, she heard footsteps crossing stone. Measured, unhurried, alone. In the silence that followed, another sound rose from her own throat before she could stop it. A low melody, barely more than breath. From the corridor outside, someone stopped walking. The footsteps outside the corridor did not move again for several breaths. Adela stopped at once. The melody died in her throat so quickly it almost hurt. In the dark, every woman in that narrow room went still. They had all learned the same lesson long before she arrived. A sound that belonged to your old life could become dangerous in a new one. Then the steps continued, slow across the stone, and faded toward the inner patio. No one spoke until morning. At dawn, the estate divided itself into its usual order. The peons had already gone out into the corn before the light had fully climbed the hills, their bodies disappearing in rows of pale dust and green blades. In the rear wing, Jacinta woke the women with a hand to the shoulder and no wasted word. The water for washing was cold enough to sting. The first irons had to be heated before the household stirred. The kitchen smelled of onions, ashes, and maize paste. Somewhere above all of it, in the rooms of the family, shutters opened one by one, and the day of the powerful began only after the day of the others had already spent its first strength. Adela worked without being told twice. She learned how this house liked shirts folded, napkins stacked, collars pressed, pitchers carried. She learned where to stand when a bell rang, and where never to stand at all. She learned that obedience had many shades, and that the safest one was the kind that looked immediate. Yet even while she learned, she changed nothing in the one place Jacinta had warned her to protect. She bowed her head when spoken to. She answered softly. She moved fast. But inside herself, she kept one straight line. By the second afternoon, Jacinta sent her to the washing yard. It was a long stone basin, darkened by years of soap and hard water. The air there was full of wet linen, sun on lime walls, and the sharp, clean bite of lye. Adela knelt with the other women and copied their rhythm. Cloth against stone, rinse, wring, fold, stack. For a while, she said nothing. Then, almost without thinking, she began to hum again. Lower, this time, woven into the slap of laundry and the trickle of runoff water down the groove in the yard. Jacinta heard it from the shade and closed her eyes for one moment. That evening, when the work was done and the light had thinned to gold along the courtyard wall, she sat beside Adela on an overturned basket. "One day," she said quietly, looking ahead instead of at her, "when I know death is near, you will sing that whole song for me. Not a piece. All of it. A song from home should not die in a stranger's mouth unfinished." Adela turned toward her. It was the gentlest request anyone had made of her since the ships. Before she could answer, a man's voice came from the archway behind them. "What language is that?" Tomas asked. Tomas did not step fully into the yard when he asked it. He stayed beneath the archway where the evening shadow began, one hand resting against the lime-washed wall as if he had only paused there by chance. His coat was still dusty from the outer buildings. The last light caught at the edge of his jaw and the dark fall of his hair. But his eyes were on Adela, not on Jacinta, and certainly not on the linen spread over the rope lines. That was the first thing the older woman noticed. Jacinta rose at once. Respect in that house had a shape. "It is nothing for the young master to concern himself with," she said. Tomas gave a small nod, though he did not leave. "I asked the girl." The words settled heavily between them. Jacinta heard the distance in it and approved. Adela heard the same distance and was disappointed by it before she had any right to be. She set down the wet sheet in her hands. Water ran from the hem over her fingers and onto the stone. "Yoruba," she said. He repeated it once, softly, trying to place the sound correctly. He failed on the middle syllable. Adela noticed. A strange thing stirred in her then, faint and dangerous. The memory of a world in which names mattered enough to be spoken carefully. Tomas came one step closer. "Is that the language you are singing in?" Jacinta answered before Adela could. "She was working, senor." There it was again, that form of address, sharp as a pin. In houses like that, a single word could close a gate. Tomas understood the warning. So did Adela. He should have taken it and gone. A man with more sense, or less feeling, would have done exactly that. Instead, he asked, "And where is Yoruba spoken?" The washing yard had gone quiet around them. Even the younger women, bent over basins, had slowed their hands. Adela looked at him fully then. She remembered the courtyard. She remembered how he had looked at her there, with more unrest than cruelty. She also remembered what men with clean hands could afford to be curious about. "In the place where I was a child," she said. It was not a full answer, and he knew it. Still, he accepted it with a slight movement of his head. "I see." No, he did not, that was plain, but something in his face said he wished to. He left after that, finally, his boots sounding hollow against the corridor stones. Jacinta watched until he was gone, then turned back to Adela with the expression of a woman who had seen a spark fall into dry grass. "That one," she said quietly, "keeps kindness kept in the shadows. Men like him are loved for too little." Adela lowered her gaze to the basin. "I did not ask for kindness. I know." Jacinta's voice softened. "That is why it may reach for you anyway." Later that night, while the rear wing settled into breathing and darkness, Tomas stood in his father's library with a candle in his hand, running his fingers along rows of cracked leather spines, searching for one word he had never needed before, finding almost nothing. The shelves gave him nothing he could hold. Tomas stood there longer than he needed to, the candle dripping warm wax over his knuckles while he pulled down one volume after another. Trade routes, church commentaries, a worm-eaten geography of kingdoms his father would never visit, a legal manual concerned with bodies, property, and signatures. There were pages on silver, cattle, drought, and the management of indigo vats gone sour. There was almost nothing on the people from whom men like his father profited. A name had entered his house, and the library had no place to set it down. That absence shamed him more than ignorance alone should have done. The next days moved as estate days always moved, with the sameness that made suffering useful. Adela carried water, folded linen, hauled wash, polished cups, learned the roots of service. When bells rang from the main rooms, she came quickly. When Jacinta corrected the angle of a cloth or the way a tray should be balanced on one hand, she listened and adjusted. She did not make herself small in the inward way the others had been taught to do. Even bowed over work, there remained something gathered and whole in her. Jacinta noticed it. So did Tomas, though he would have denied it if denial had been enough. He found reasons to cross the yards more often. Never reasons that would shame him if spoken aloud. A question for the steward, a glance at the drying lines, a missing tally from the storehouse. Kindness kept in the shadows always dresses itself as accident. That is how men preserve the comfort of thinking well of themselves while still obeying the world that made them cowards. Tomas was not cruel. That was true. It was also true that goodness, when it fears witness, can become another softness the powerful enjoy at no cost. Adela understood this sooner than he did. One hot afternoon, the stone yard shimmered under the sun. The smell of wet rope, soap, and heated dust hung low in the air. Adela was carrying 2 pails from the well to the kitchen passage, one in each hand, her arms taut from the weight. She had nearly crossed the open stretch when the rusted handle on the left bucket gave way with a sharp snap. Water rushed over her skirt and across the courtyard stones. The pail struck the ground and rolled, clanging once against the wall. She stopped where she was, from weariness. The kind that reaches so deep a person cannot even summon anger for a small disaster. Tomas saw it from the corridor. He came down the steps before Gaspar, before the kitchen maid, before anyone could turn waste into accusation. He bent, picked up the broken bucket, and looked at the jagged metal eye where the handle had torn free. "I will have this repaired," he said. Adela's hands were wet to the wrists. A dark strand of hair had slipped loose against her temple. She looked at him, steady and unreadable. "It is not necessary, senor." That word again. Senor. He felt it land. "I know," he answered. "Give it to me anyway." She hesitated only a moment, then placed the broken bucket in his hands. Before sunrise the next morning, while the hacienda still slept, Tomas saddled a mule and took the road toward the town forge, half an hour away, where the blacksmith would ask the one question he had not yet dared to ask himself. The road to town was still gray with morning when Tomas rode out. Mist clung low over the fields, and the mule's hooves made a dull sound in the damp earth before the track turned stony. Half an hour from the hacienda, the blacksmith's forge was already awake. Sparks jumped in the dimness. Iron rang against iron. Smoke, charcoal, and hot metal hung in the throat like something a man could chew. Melchor Ruiz, the smith, took the broken bucket in one hand, turned it once, and lifted his brows without asking at first whose servant had worn it out. Tomas said only, "The handle tore loose. I need it mended well." Melchor grunted and set the bucket near the fire. "For the house?" "For the house." That answer might have ended it with another man, but blacksmiths, like priests and old women, often knew more than anyone intended to tell them. Melchor heated the rivets, worked in silence for a while, then said, without looking up, "You came early for a kitchen pail, Don Tomas." Tomas watched the hammer strike. "I was already on the road." "No." Melchor slid a new iron loop into place. "You chose the road." Tomas did not answer. He had no answer that would not expose him even to himself. By the time he returned, the sun had climbed, and the courtyard smelled of warmed stone and horse sweat. He did not send a peon with the repaired bucket. He carried it himself to the washing yard. The new metal gleamed brighter than the old. Melchor had strengthened the second handle, too, without being asked. That small extra care touched Tomas in a way praise from respectable men never had. Adela was at the basin, sleeves rolled, forearms wet with suds. When he held the pail out to her, she looked first at the repair, then at him. "It will hold," he said. Her fingers brushed the iron as she took it. Just a brief touch, accidental enough to be denied by anyone who wished to deny it. Still, something changed in the air between them. He felt it. So did she. Jacinta, sorting linens nearby, felt it most of all. "Thank you, senor," Adela said. Her voice was quiet, careful. Yet there was less distance in it than the day before, and that was more dangerous than warmth. Warmth can be hidden. Less distance begins to show itself in pauses, in breath, in the length of a look. Tomas nodded and left before he could linger. That was his manner from the start. He moved toward her, then away. A hand extended, then withdrawn. A conscience, waking up in pieces, still behaves like a coward. Because courage does not arrive all at once simply because a man has felt something true. That night, Jacinta sat beside Adela while mending a torn cuff by candlelight. The flame made the old scars on her hands shine pale. "You must be careful," she said. "He repaired a bucket. He did more than that, and you know it." Adela lowered her eyes to the cloth in her lap. "He has done nothing wrong." Jacinta gave a tired little breath. "Sometimes that is the beginning of trouble. The men who wound us most are often the ones who mean to be good." Before Adela could answer, a boy from the main corridor appeared at the open door, shifting from foot to foot. "The master calls for Don Tomas," he said. "Now, in the office." In that house, when a father summoned his son at night, it was rarely for anything small. The summons was waiting for him like a closed door. Don Balthazar's office always smelled of ink, leather, and old tobacco, with a little damp trapped in the walls from years of rainy seasons and ledgers kept too near the floor. The candle on the desk burned low. The account book lay open where his father had left it, one thick finger marking a column of numbers, as if the household itself were nothing more than figures to be moved from one page to another. Tomas stopped just inside. He knew that room. He knew the way his father used silence before instruction, and how a man could be cornered there without a single raised voice. "You went to town for a bucket," Don Balthazar said. Tomas kept his face still. "I had other matters on the road." His father gave a short breath through his nose. He did not care enough to challenge the lie. "In March, you will marry." The words came so cleanly that for a moment they did not seem to belong to any world Tomas had been inhabiting. Don Balthazar turned a page with careful fingers. "The eldest daughter of the Villaseñor family, Puebla people, land, name, and enough debt to understand the value of alliance. She is said to be well brought up and healthy. That is sufficient." Tomas stared at him. "Father." "In March," Don Balthazar repeated. "The priest will be written to. Her family has already answered with good sense." That was the cruelty of powerful men who never needed to shout. They arranged the future before the people inside it had found their words. Tomas did have words, somewhere. He felt them crowding his throat. He should have said he did not want this. He should have asked by what right another life was being fastened to his. He should have named the unrest that had entered him since the red road, since the courtyard, since the sound of that low melody in the dark. Instead, he stood there, as decent cowards do, with his conscience awake and his courage lagging behind it. Don Balthazar looked up then, small, sharp eyes set in a heavy face. "Do not embarrass me by pretending surprise. A house like this survives by agreements, not by feelings." Tomas left with the taste of iron in his mouth. The night air outside felt colder than it should have. He crossed the corridor without seeing the saints in their niches, without hearing the peons in the far quarters laughing over some late jug of aguardiente. In the rear wing, women were still finishing the last of the washing. Adela stood by the long table, folding linen into neat white squares, her sleeves rolled down now, the lamplight turning her cheekbone to bronze. He stopped at the threshold. She looked up at once. It was a habit by now, that silent awareness of him before he spoke. For one breath, neither of them moved. Then she saw something in his face change, something heavy and newly placed there. Before he could decide whether to step forward or turn away, she said very softly, "What has happened, Señor?" For a moment, he almost told her. The lamp on the folding table threw a small amber circle over the linen, over her hands, over the plain brown wool of his sleeve where it hung at his side without purpose. Beyond that circle, the rear wing lay in shadow. The other women had drifted away, one by one, carrying stacked cloth, banked coals, basins, excuses. Jacinta remained somewhere deeper in the corridor, near enough to hear if voices rose, far enough to pretend she heard nothing at all. Tomas looked at Adela, as if the words might arrange themselves if he stared long enough. They did not. "My father has settled a match," he said at last. "I am to marry in March." He said it plainly, but plain words are sometimes the cruelest. They leave no corner where hope can hide for another hour. Adela did not drop the napkin in her hands. She did not gasp. She only held the cloth still, fingers resting against the fold she had just made. Then she lowered her gaze to the table with such care that anyone else might have mistaken it for obedience. It was not obedience. It was discipline. "I understand, Señor." That title again, formal, clean. Cold enough to put a wall back where, for a few dangerous days, there had been only air. He felt it at once. "Adela." She lifted her head then, and once more she would not lower her eyes. Not in defiance, in clarity. "You do not owe me an explanation." The sentence struck him harder than reproach would have done. Reproach asks for something. It still believes there is a debt to be paid. This gave him back his freedom too easily, and for that reason it felt unbearable. He took a step toward her. "It is not what I would have chosen." Her face changed only slightly, but enough. A quiet tightening at the mouth. The smallest shutter brought down behind the eyes. "Then choose otherwise." He could not answer. There, in that silence, lay the whole shape of him. A man decent enough to suffer over injustice, tender enough to repair what breaks in his hands, and still too bound by his father's shadow to break anything that truly mattered. Goodness without courage has a tragic way of admiring itself, while someone else bears the cost. Tomas knew this in some buried place. He knew it, and yet knowing is cheaper than acting. Adela folded the napkin once more and laid it on the stack. "If Doña Jacinta asks, I will say you came to inspect the linen." He heard the dismissal in her mercy. When he turned to leave, he stopped at the doorway and looked back. She was already working again, but her movements had lost something soft. He had not noticed until then how much he had come to depend on that softness being there. The marriage bargain moved quickly after that. A letter was written before dawn. By the next week, Puebla had sent its answer, and with the answer came a name spoken for the first time in the main house. Inés Villaseñor. The name altered the house before the woman herself ever crossed its threshold. Letters began traveling between Oaxaca and Puebla. New cloth was measured. Silver was taken out, polished, counted, and wrapped again. Don Baltazar walked with the heavy satisfaction of a man who believed he had secured the future by arranging 2 surnames across a table. Even the servants' work changed its rhythm. Extra linens were aired. Guest rooms were opened and swept. Old curtains came down for beating. In the kitchen, preserves were set aside under cloth and wax for a celebration still months away. For Adela, the change was quieter and more exact. No one gave her a speech. No one needed to. A woman in her place learned quickly how an entire house could shift its pressure without ever naming the reason. Tomas no longer crossed the washing yard unless a real excuse forced him there. When he did pass through, he kept his eyes on ledgers, tack, harness, anything that did not answer back. She, in turn, answered him only when required. "Yes, señor. At once, señor. The tray is ready, señor." Those little courtesies did what anger could not have done. They reminded him every time of the distance he had chosen to preserve. Jacinta saw all of it. One evening, while they sorted napkins, stiff from starch, she said, "A woman does not always know the hour when her heart begins making a fool of her. Usually an old woman has to tell her." Adela kept folding. "You think mine has?" "I think yours is trying to." The older woman's hands moved slowly over the cloth, twisted fingers working by long habit. Do not hand your peace to a man who has not yet proved he can hold it in daylight. Adela did not answer. That silence was answer enough. March approached. Then came the date itself. The wedding would be held on the 15th. The whole valley seemed to hear of it at once. Guests were expected from Puebla, from the city, from neighboring ranches whose owners measured one another's standing by invitations, marriages, and how many musicians could be hired for a feast. The peons were promised 1 free day and half a cuartillo of aguardiente, spoken of by Gaspar as if generosity had entered the house in person. The chapel priest came twice to consult with Don Baltazar. Tailors arrived. A seamstress spent 3 full afternoons with Tomas's mother. And then, one dry, bright morning, the bride arrived to inspect the hacienda before the wedding. Inés Villaseñor stepped down from her carriage in a traveling dress the color of ash rose, her gloves buttoned neat at the wrist despite the dust of the road. She was 23, pale in the way of women kept out of sun by rank, with copper-brown hair hidden beneath a bonnet and a mouth too composed to be called gentle. She greeted Don Baltazar with perfect manners. She kissed the hand of Tomas's mother. She accepted Tomas's arm for the walk into the courtyard. Then, while crossing under the laurel, she glanced once toward the servants carrying luggage through the side passage. Her eyes settled on Adela for half a breath. In that half-breath, Jacinta, standing behind a stack of folded cloth, understood that the true trouble had finally arrived. Jacinta was right to mistrust a glance that brief. Inés needed only that first visit to understand more than anyone had told her. She was not foolish, and she had not come from Puebla wrapped in ribbons and ignorance. Women raised for marriage into land and debt learned early to read rooms the way men read account books. They noticed where voices shifted, where silences thickened, where a servant was too carefully ignored. By supper, she had already marked the patterns. Tomas addressed the steward directly, the cook politely, his mother dutifully, and the dark young woman from the rear wing with a restraint so deliberate it might as well have been touch. Adela felt that inspection like cold water down the spine. The next morning, Inés asked for chocolate in her chamber and requested that the new one bring it. Her tone was gentle. That was what made the order unsettling. Harsh women were easier to survive. Their blows could be anticipated. Soft voices required more caution. Adela carried the tray through a room that smelled of rose powder, travel dust, and lavender folded into fresh linen. Sunlight came through the shutters in pale bars. Inés sat before a mirror, while a maid from Puebla unpinned her hair. "What is your name?" she asked, watching Adela through the glass. "Adela, señora." "From where?" Adela lowered her gaze to the tray. "From far away, señora." Inés accepted the cup. "That is not a place." "No, señora." The maid from Puebla gave a small laugh and then swallowed it when Inés did not join her. For one long moment, the room held only the faint clink of porcelain against the saucer. Then Inés said, "You will attend me while I am here. I prefer quick hands and quiet habits." It sounded like favor. Jacinta knew better the moment she heard of it. From then on, the little humiliations began, each one slight enough to deny if anyone objected. A shawl folded twice because the corners displeased her, water fetched and then dismissed untouched because it had stood too long, a lace cuff blamed on careless starching, though the fault was old Frey. Once, before Tomas's mother and two visiting women from town, Inés asked Adela to brush dust from the hem of her dress while continuing a conversation about embroidery, as if she were adjusting a chair leg. That was the cruelty of well-bred people. They could reduce a human being and still keep their voices musical. Tomas saw pieces of it. He never saw enough at one time to force himself into action, or so he told himself. In truth, he saw what mattered. He saw Adela growing quieter in a new way, not with fear, but with economy. He saw how she stood straighter after each slight, as if dignity had become labor too. He saw, and he chose the old refuge of men like him, delay. That afternoon, passing the inner corridor, he slowed at the sound of Inés speaking inside her chamber. "Leave the combs," she said, "and send Adela back. I think she has not yet understood how things will be in this house." What Inés meant by that, Adela learned before the day was out. She was called back to the chamber just as the sun leaned hottest against the south wall, and the whole upper floor held the dry smell of warmed plaster, rose water, and travel trunks left open too long. Inés was seated near the shutters with a length of white muslin across her lap, sorting ribbons that did not need sorting. The maid from Puebla had been dismissed. That alone told Adela this was meant to be private. "From now on," Inés said without looking up at first, "you will attend only to my rooms, my clothing, and my person when needed. I do not like too many hands touching what belongs to me." The words were mild. The possession inside them was not. Adela lowered her head the proper amount. "Yes, señora." Inés lifted her eyes then. "You answer well. Let us hope you learn as quickly in everything else." It began there. A basin carried up and then sent down untouched because the water had cooled. A bodice unlaced and laced again because the pull at the waist felt uneven. A comb laid half an inch from the place Inés preferred, corrected with a smile thin as thread. A shawl folded twice, then unfolded and held up to the light, while Inés asked whether dust from the rear wing had made all household cloth seem dim. Every slight was small enough to pass for preference. That was the craft of women like her. Open malice could be named. Precision disguised as order could not. Adela endured it with the same stillness she brought to all difficult things. She did not plead. She did not explain what needed no explanation. She performed each task again and again, hands steady, shoulders quiet. Yet inside, something changed. Humiliation repeated in little measured doses does strange work on the soul. It does not always break a person quickly. Sometimes it teaches a harder kind of balance, the kind required to stand upright where there is no kindness in the room at all. Tomas saw more than he admitted. One afternoon he crossed the upper corridor and found Adela kneeling beside an overturned trunk, refolding garments she had already arranged that morning. Ines sat nearby, reading a letter she was not really reading. The pause in his step was brief, but not brief enough. Ines noticed. She always noticed what men believed hidden. "Your servant is improving," she said lightly. The word servant did not trouble Adela. The your did. Tomas answered after half a beat too long. "She is diligent." Ines smiled without warmth. "Yes, that is useful." He should have stayed. He should have asked why a task finished at dawn required doing again at noon. He should have heard the strain in the quiet and chosen, for once, not to leave a woman alone inside it. He moved on. That was his habit still. A hand almost extended, then drawn back. A conscience active only where no one demanded it prove itself. That night, in the rear wing, Jacinta listened while Adela untied the cloth from her hair with tired fingers. The candle flame shivered in the draught under the door. "Enough," the older woman said at last. "I know a family in town, indigenous people, decent. They keep a small mill and need another pair of hands." Adela looked up sharply. Jacinta's bent hands rested on her knees. "If the price suits him, your master would sell your service. Not from mercy, from arithmetic. And if that day comes, child, you must decide whether staying here is worth what it is beginning to cost you." Adela did not answer Jacinta at once. The candle between them had burned low, and the small rear room smelled of tallow, damp cloth, and the faint sourness of the day's labor still clinging to their skirts. Outside, somewhere in the yard, a mule stamped once and settled. Jacinta waited with the patience of a woman who had learned that life-changing thoughts should never be hurried. At last, Adela asked, "Who are these people?" "Good people," Jacinta said. "As good as this world allows. They are from the town beyond the chapel road. They keep a small mill and a little patch of land. The father is called Mateo Shu. The oldest son needs help. Not this kind of help." Her bent fingers rubbed slowly at one knuckle. "Work for pay. A roof. Food that is yours because you earned it, not because it was left over on another plate. The priest knows them. If money is offered, your master might let you go." Adela lowered her eyes to the straw mat in thought. To be sold had once meant only one thing to her: loss. Another road, another gate, another place where her name would be shortened and her body measured. Yet Jacinta had placed a different shape beside that fear. A possibility. Small, imperfect, still bought and bargained through the hands of others, but real enough to disturb her sleep. The next days made the thought harder to put away. Ines grew more exact. She called for Adela 3 times in one morning to refasten the same pearl buttons. At noon, she sent back a washed kerchief because the starch was too stiff for gentle skin, then later complained that a second one lacked firmness. Once, in the dressing room, she tipped a glass carafe just enough to send cool water down the front of Adela's dress, then touched her own mouth with 2 fingers, as if surprised by her own clumsiness. "How unfortunate," she said, while Tomas's mother sat nearby with embroidery in her lap and did not lift her head. That silence mattered. Adela felt it. There are cruelties that bruise the flesh, and there are cruelties that ask the room to agree they never happened. The second kind travels deeper. Adela took the wet cloths, changed her apron, and went on. But later, carrying dawn water across the inner patio, she caught herself thinking of a road out of the hacienda for the first time without shame. It was still dark enough for the sky to remain violet when it happened. The flagstone under her foot shifted. One bucket lurched, and a silver sheet of water spread across the stones. Adela stopped short, cold, running over her toes. From the herb bed in the corner came a woman's voice, low and even. "That stone has been loose for 7 years," said Doña Mercedes, Tomas's mother. "And no man in this house has remembered it for longer than that." Doña Mercedes did not sound startled by the spill, only tired. She stood beside a narrow bed of rue, mint, and chamomile, wrapped in a gray wool rebozo against the dawn chill. Her hair, threaded with early silver, was pinned simply at the nape. In the weak blue light before sunrise, she looked less like the mistress of a hacienda and more like a woman borrowing a little quiet before the rest of the house woke and began asking things of her. Adela bent at once to lift the bucket, but Doña Mercedes raised one hand. "Leave it. The kitchen can wait a minute longer than men ever imagine." It was such a small mercy that Adela did not know what to do with it. The older woman came closer, careful on the uneven stones, and looked down at the loosened slab with an expression almost dryly amused. "I have told the foreman about that one for years. He always promises to remember." She glanced at Adela's wet hem. "And he never does." Adela kept her eyes lowered out of caution, yet not in the empty way the house preferred. "I will bring more water, Signora." "In a moment." Doña Mercedes reached down, touched one of the herb leaves, and released a sharp, clean smell into the air. "Do you know what this is?" "Mint," Adela said after a pause. "Good. And this?" "Rue, I think." Doña Mercedes gave the slightest nod. "You listen when people teach you. That is rarer in this house than obedience." The line might have been dangerous in another mouth. In hers, it sounded like private truth that had slipped out by habit. For a few breaths, they stood in the pale cold with the water shining across the stones, the kitchen still dark behind them, the rest of the hacienda not yet fully awake. Adela felt, very faintly, the strange ease of being spoken to as if she possessed a mind worth using. It happened again 2 mornings later. Then the morning after that. Their exchanges stayed small at first, about basil that helped the stomach, about how dry the air had grown, about whether the late rains would be enough for the corn. But small talk in a place like that was never only small. It was a gate left ajar. Doña Mercedes had spent many years being politely overlooked by her husband and carefully excluded from matters decided by men. She knew invisibility from the inside, even if hers wore lace cuffs and rosary beads. Something in Adela's stillness answered that knowledge. One dawn, while tying up sage with a strip of linen, she asked, "What do you miss most?" Adela's hands tightened around the bucket handle. Not a person, she thought. To say mother would be too raw. To say home would be too wide. The answer that came surprised even her. "The rhythm," she said softly. Doña Mercedes looked up. The rhythm of what? Adela searched for the words in this language, the only language available now for losses it had not caused and could never repair. Of mornings, of voices, of how people moved before... She stopped. Before ships, before chains, before being bought for less than the mule. Doña Mercedes did not press. She only studied her for a moment, and in that look there was neither pity nor curiosity. There was recognition. Then a step sounded in the corridor beyond the patio. Tomás, coming through the dim archway earlier than anyone expected, heard the last word she had almost spoken. Tomás stopped when he heard that unfinished word, but he did not step fully into the patio. Doña Mercedes turned first. She did not seem embarrassed to be found speaking with a woman from the rear wing. If anything, her face settled into the mild stillness of someone who had spent half a lifetime learning how to hide meaning in plain sight. Adela lowered her gaze to the wet stones, one hand still on the bucket handle. "You are early," Doña Mercedes said to her son. "There is work at the lower sheds." "That would be a first before sunrise," she replied. and for the smallest instant something dry and almost amused passed through her eyes. Tomas let that pass. His attention had already gone to Adela. "You spilled the water." "The stone moved, senor," Adela said. His mother answered for her, "as it has moved for years." There was no accusation in Doña Mercedes's voice, yet he heard one anyway. And not about the stone. Men in that house were good at letting small failures endure until women and servants adjusted their steps around them. He looked down at the dark patch spreading across the flagstones, then back at Adela. Her skirt hem was wet. Her hands were reddened by cold. He wanted to ask what she had been about to say. He asked instead, "Was anyone hurt?" "No, senor." Always that measured distance now. It had become her shield, and because he had helped forge it, he had no right to resent it. The mornings after that drew them, strangely, into the same patch of hour before the house awakened. Not together exactly, never in a way anyone could name, but often Tomas crossed the inner patio while his mother tended herbs and Adela carried water or kindling. A few words would be exchanged, the weather, the broken cistern latch, the dryness in the maize stores, little things. Yet little things, repeated, make their own road. It was during one of those cold dawns that Doña Mercedes mentioned the stores in passing. "We lost flour again," she said, pinching a leaf between finger and thumb. "The cook blames damp. The steward blames mice." Adela, setting down a bucket, said quietly, "It is not only damp." Both of them looked at her. She hesitated. Speaking usefully in a place where your usefulness has never been invited can feel like stepping onto thin ice. "The sacks are stacked too close to the wall," she said. "The stone sweats at night. The lower grain takes the wet first. And the mice come because the sweepings are left near the door." Doña Mercedes stared at her for a moment, not offended, only surprised. Tomas said nothing. He had seen her work. He had seen her endure. He had not yet understood that she also watched everything. That same afternoon he went to the storage room himself. The smell of old grain and lime dust met him at the door. He crouched, put his hand to the lowest sacks, and felt the dampness in the cloth exactly where she had said it would be. By evening, 3 sacks had been moved, the sweepings cleared, and the cook was muttering that perhaps the new arrangement was sensible after all. Tomas did not tell anyone whose thought it had been. But 2 nights later, under the laurel, Don Baltasar turned a page in the account ledger, frowned at a line of losses, and said, "Find out why the North Granary keeps bleeding money." For the first time, Tomas knew exactly whose answer he wanted. The question stayed with Tomas long after his father closed the ledger. Why does the North Granary keep losing money? Don Baltasar had asked it the way he asked about weathered beams, lame mules, or spoiled dye, as if every failing thing in his house ought to justify itself in numbers. Tomas left the Laurel Court with the account still sounding in his ears. He already knew the answer had begun in a dawn patio beside a loose stone and a spilled bucket. What troubled him was not where the answer had come from. It was what would happen if he admitted it aloud. He found Adela in the storage passage after noon, carrying folded sacking to the rear shelves. The place smelled of grain dust, dry wood, and the faint rot of old damp trapped in corners. Light entered in narrow stripes through the slats, laying pale bars across the floor. She paused when she saw him, then waited. "I checked the sacks," he said. Her face did not change much, but he saw the small alertness in her eyes. "And?" "You were right." He had meant to say more carefully than that, measured, distant. Yet the words came out simple and almost grateful. For a heartbeat, something softer returned to her expression, something he had been missing without admitting it. Then caution covered it again. "There is more," she said. Tomas glanced toward the doorway. Empty. "Tell me." She set the folded sacking down and spoke quietly, looking not at him, but at the wall behind his shoulder. That, too, was caution. "The sacks should not rest directly on stone. Wood first, then grain. and the men stack the newer ones behind the old because it is easier, so the old sits too long. The mice come to the same corner because the broomings are left there every evening. Also, she hesitated. Also what? The hinge on the north door hangs low. It is not shut true. In rain, the wet comes under. Tomas stared at her. It was not only that she had seen the trouble, it was the way she had seen it. As a pattern, with causes linked to causes, labor linked to waste, carelessness linked to cost. In that instant, he understood something his father never would have expected from a woman the house had measured only by her back and hands. "You notice everything," he said. At that, she looked at him directly. "In places where one cannot choose much, one learns to notice." The line struck him harder than reproach. He felt, all at once, the full poverty of his own position. He moved through the hacienda as a son, an heir, a man. She moved through it with less power than the lock on a pantry door. Yet she was the one truly awake to how the whole house functioned. By evening, he had the north door rehung, the sacks lifted onto timber, and the sweepings cleared. Don Balthazar said nothing when the first tally improved. He only frowned at the page the next morning and tapped the margin with one blunt finger. Then he looked up at his son and said, "Who told you where to look?" Tomas did not answer his father at once. The laurel leaves shifted overhead with a dry whisper. In the courtyard, a servant crossed with a tray and kept his eyes down. Beyond the wall, somewhere near the stables, a mule gave a short, restless snort. Don Balthazar waited with the patience of a man accustomed to obedience, arriving sooner or later. His thick fingers still rested on the line in the ledger where the losses had begun to shrink. "I looked for myself," Tomas said at last. His father's gaze stayed on him a moment too long. "That is not what I asked." Tomas felt the old pressure then, the one that had shaped him since childhood. Not fear of a blow. Don Balthazar did not need blows. He had a heavier weapon, the steady demand that every person around him name their usefulness, and every idea justify its source. "I listened," Tomas said. "To whom?" There it was, the small, brutal question at the center of the house. Whose mind counts? Whose does not? Whose voice may exist only if a man of rank repeats it? Tomas might still have lied. He might have given the cook the credit, or the steward, or claimed the thing as his own outright. That would have been easier. Easier for him, easier for the order of the house, easier for everyone except the truth. But some truths, once felt clearly enough, begin pushing against a man from the inside. "A woman from the rear wing noticed it," he said. Don Balthazar's face did not change much, though something sharpened behind the eyes. "Which woman?" Tomas named her. The old man closed the ledger, then opened it again as if numbers might calm whatever thought had crossed his mind. "The same one you had mending pails?" Heat rose in Tomas's neck. "The same one who was right." That answer might have gone badly on another day, but figures had improved, and Don Balthazar was, before anything else, a man loyal to profit. Useful truth could. He grunted once, low in his throat. "Tomorrow," he said. "Bring her when I inspect the north granary." Tomas stared at him. His father looked up. "If she sees waste, I will hear what she sees. If she is wrong, she goes back to soap and linen. If she is right—" He let the sentence hang, unfinished, which in that house was often worse than ending it. "Bring her." From the shaded corridor beyond the courtyard, a skirt brushed against the wall. Tomas turned too late to see more than the edge of pale fabric withdrawing. Inés. She had heard enough. Of course she had. Women in danger of losing their place listened more carefully than anyone. That evening, he found Adela near the storage room, sorting torn grain sacks from usable ones. Dust silvered her hands to the wrists. The air smelled of burlap, dry corn, and old wood. "My father wants to question you tomorrow," he said. She went still. For what? For telling the truth? Her eyes lifted to his then, dark and steady, and for one impossible second, he thought she might laugh at the cruelty hidden in that answer. Instead, she asked the question that mattered. And when your wife hears it from his mouth, she said softly, what do you think she will do? Tomas knew the answer to her question, and hated that he knew it so quickly. Inés will not like it, he said. Adela's face did not harden. That would have been easier for him. Instead, she only looked tired. And there is something far more difficult in being judged by someone too weary to bother with anger. Dust from the grain sacks lay pale along her wrists. A loose strand of hair clung to the side of her neck where the storage room heat had dampened her skin. Then do not ask me to stand before him, she said. He wanted to say he was not asking, that his father had commanded it, that this was somehow different. But the differences that matter to men with choices rarely matter to women without them. He heard that truth and stayed silent too long. Again, that was his pattern. Feeling first, delay second, regret after. A man can become very skilled at suffering over the consequences of his own caution. It gives him the shape of virtue without requiring the labor of bravery. Tomas was beginning to understand this about himself, and the understanding did not improve him fast enough. Inés already heard enough to be suspicious, he said finally. If my father summons you and you refuse, it will be worse. Adela lowered her eyes for a moment, not to submit, but to think. It may be worse if I obey. He had no honest reply to that. The next day, Don Baltasar inspected the granary with the same expression he might have worn while examining a cracked yoke or a weak harvest row. He did not greet Adela. He looked at the sacks, the rehung door, the raised wooden slats under the grain, the swept corner where mice had nested. Then he turned to her. You saw this before the steward did? Yes, senor. And before my son? A pause. Yes, senor. He grunted once. Why? Adela glanced at the stone threshold where rain marks showed beneath the door. Because I carry through this room, senor. I pass it more often. It was a careful answer, but not a false one. Don Baltasar watched her with the narrow concentration of a man doing sums in his head. He asked 2 more questions. She answered both, plainly, without trying to sound clever and without pretending not to be. That balance unsettled him almost as much as her usefulness did. By evening, the old man had made another adjustment to the grain records. 2 days later, he asked Tomas whether the south store might need restacking as well. That was how power sometimes yielded, not to justice, but to efficiency. If a person proved useful often enough, even prejudice learned to bend a little. Inés saw the bend and hated it. Her displeasure sharpened into something colder. She no longer corrected Adela only in private. Now there were witnesses. A cuff redone in front of Tomas's mother, a tray returned before 2 visiting cousins from the next valley, a remark over breakfast about certain servants becoming too noticeable. Each slight was dressed in elegance and offered like sugared poison. That night, in the rear wing, Jacinta's cough lasted longer than usual. When it finally eased, she pressed one hand to her chest and whispered, "Child, if I die in this place, promise me one thing." Adela moved closer at once. "What thing?" Jacinta's bent fingers found hers in the dark. "When the time comes," she said, "sing me the whole song." After that night, Jacinta's cough never truly left her. It settled into the rear wing like an unwelcome third breath between the sleeping women. Some mornings it was only a dry catching in the chest. Other mornings it bent her nearly double over the wash basin. One hand braced on the stone, while the other pressed against her ribs, as if she could hold herself together by force. Winter had come down from the Sierra by then. The cold entered through cracks in the adobe, crept over the floor, and lodged in the bones before dawn. The women slept closer, sharing blankets, turning through the night so the same body did not take all the chill from the wall. Adela began waking before the others to warm water for her. She did it quietly, with a kind of care that asks for no witness. Jacinta accepted the help the way proud women accept the things they can no longer refuse, with very little speech and no self-pity. Yet one evening, when the air smelled of damp wool and ash, and the candle flame leaned sideways in the draught, she caught Adela's wrist with those bent, work-worn fingers and said, "Do not spend your whole strength keeping me here. I have been leaving for years. Only now the house has noticed." Adela knelt beside her mat. "Do not say that." Jacinta's eyes, clouded by fatigue, held hers steadily. "Listen to me. I chose the first way for too long. I bent and bent until the bending entered my hands, my back, my sleep. You must not do the same. If the road opens, take it." She coughed, waited for the pain to pass, then whispered, "And when I ask, sing." The asking came before dawn 3 days later. Outside, a hard wind worried the eaves. Somewhere in the dark, a loose shutter tapped and tapped against its frame. Jacinta's breathing had gone shallow in the night, then rough, then strangely light, as though each breath were already half somewhere else. The other women woke and withdrew into stillness. No one called a priest. Women like them knew when a priest would come too late to matter. Adela sat beside her, one hand wrapped around the old woman's twisted fingers, and when Jacinta opened her eyes, she said only, "Now." So Adela sang. Very softly at first, because the song had lived so long inside her unsaid that bringing it out felt like pulling thread through scarred skin. Then steadier. It was a song from home, older than this valley, older than these walls, older than the names by which this house had tried to contain her. The other women did not understand the words, but they understood the tenderness in them, and the grief, and the strange peace that entered the room as the melody moved through the cold air. Jacinta died before the song ended. She simply breathed out and did not return. They buried her on the slope beyond the chapel wall where the poor of the estate were laid under rough earth and small stones. The morning was gray, the soil hard. Adela stood with numb hands and wind-stung eyes while the men with shovels finished their work. When no one was looking, she took from the hem of her skirt a small seed she had carried across years and crossings without ever knowing for whom she had saved it. She pressed it into the fresh earth above Jacinta and covered it with her palm. Tomas saw her do it. He said nothing. He only stood at a distance in his dark coat, hat in both hands, and understood with a sudden coldness that the one person who had known how to hold this fragile balance together was gone. And by that same evening, Don Baltasar had already begun asking whether one fewer old servant might finally make it easier to settle the unrest in his house. Jacinta's place on the mat stayed empty, and emptiness has a way of making every other truth louder. In the rear wing, the women stepped around the absence for a few days, as if she might return from the wash-yard or the kitchen passage with another armful of linen and another dry warning on her tongue. But old women do not leave softly without taking something with them. Adela felt it in the evenings most of all. No cough in the dark, no bent hands mending by candlelight, no voice saying, "Bend where they can see you, and keep the rest for yourself." The seed she had pressed into the grave seemed more real than the air inside the room. In the main house, grief was granted less space than inconvenience. Don Baltasar did not speak Jacinta's name again. He remarked only that one fewer mouth meant smaller kitchen accounts. Then, before the week was out, he began asking quiet questions about possible placements in the town. Only for one, the useful one, the troublesome one, the one whose presence had become too visible in too many rooms. That was how such decisions were made, never openly as punishment, always as prudence. Doña Mercedes heard it first in the corridor outside the office. A priest's name was mentioned. Then the Shu family from the town beyond the chapel road. Then a sum. Not a large one. Enough to make the matter neat. Enough to move a woman from one set of hands to another and call it order restored. She said nothing at once. She had lived too long in that house to mistake silence for innocence. Yet she also knew the danger of speech spoken a moment too early. Adela learned by accident. Ines had sent her to fetch a shawl left in the front storage room. As she passed the half-open office door, Gaspar was standing just outside with his hat in his hands, listening for instructions. Don Baltasar's voice carried clearly. "Before Lent is over," he said, "I want her transferred. The town family will do. It will quiet my son's wife, and it will spare this house any further foolishness." Further foolishness. Adela did not stop walking. That was the first skill of survival. She took the shawl, returned by the long corridor, and delivered it with both hands. Ines barely looked at her. Yet something inside Adela had already gone still in a new way. The deeper thing that comes after enough disappointments have taught a person not to waste energy on surprise. That evening, Tomas found his mother in the herb patio, crushing rosemary between her fingers. "He means to sell her," Doña Mercedes said before he could speak. The words struck him with more force because she gave them no decoration at all. Tomas stared at her. "To whom?" "A family in town, I think. Decent people, by rumor. That is not the point, and you know it." He did know it. So long as Adela remained within reach, he had been able to mistake delay for possibility. A man can call tomorrow merciful when tomorrow still belongs to him. Sale changed the shape of everything. It turned his silence into a road with an end. "When?" he asked. Doña Mercedes looked toward the darkening corridor that led to his father's rooms. "Soon enough that if you wait again, the decision would be made without you." Before Tomas could answer, a servant boy came hurrying through the archway with word that the notary from town would arrive on Saturday. The word notary changed the air in the house at once. Not because anyone said much aloud. Houses like that rarely announced their ugliest business. But servants heard doors closing sooner, voices dropping lower, chairs drawn closer to office tables. Gaspar was sent to town before dawn and came back with his boots powdered white from the road. Don Baltasar asked for the account chest to be opened. Ines spent the afternoon in unusually good humor, which frightened Adela more than anger would have done. A woman in danger learns to fear calm. Tomas spent those same hours in a state he had long mistaken for thought. It was not thought. It was the old paralysis dressed in finer clothes. He crossed the yard twice, went as far as the office once, stood outside his father's door, then turned away. He told himself he needed to know the terms. He told himself he needed to choose the right moment. Men like him often call delay by noble names so they can endure their own reflection. Doña Mercedes ended that illusion for him before supper. She found him in the chapel passage where the walls held the smell of wax and old stone. Evening light came through the small window in one slant of dust. "If you are waiting for courage to arrive already formed," she said, "you will wait until another person has paid for your patience." Tomas looked at her as if she had struck him. She did not soften. "I have watched your father make decisions over living people for 30 years. He counts what can be counted and calls the rest disorder. I watched you become gentle in all the places where gentleness cost you nothing. Do not ask me to comfort you now, because the cost has finally appeared." He said her name under his breath, almost like a plea. "Mother." "No," she said quietly. "Do not bring me that tone. I know what you feel. Feeling is not rare. Action is." The words stayed with him like a fever. That night he went to the rear yard and found Adela near the well, rinsing a basin under weak moonlight. The rope creaked overhead. Damp stone smelled cold and mineral in the dark. She did not start when he approached. By then she always seemed to know when he was near. "My father has called the notary," he said. She kept one hand on the basin rim. "I know. I am trying to stop it." At that, she finally looked at him. No cruelty in her face. No hope, either. "Trying is what you do while other people decide." He took that without defense because there was no defense left. The silence between them stretched, broken only by a drip from the bucket chain. Then he said, "If I speak against him before witnesses, everything changes." Adela's expression did not move. "Everything changes anyway." He felt the truth of that so sharply it almost made him lightheaded. For the first time in his life, the path of obedience no longer looked like safety. It looked like loss already completed. He wanted to reach for her hand. He did not. Old habits do not die simply because a man has finally begun to despise them. From the upper corridor, a woman's voice cut through the night. "Tomás!" Inés stood at the balustrade above them in her white night wrapper, one hand resting on the rail, her face pale in the moonlight and very, very still. "I have been looking for you," she said. "Come to my chamber. There is something missing from my dressing table." By morning, the missing thing had become a performance. Inés did not scream. That would have lowered her. She chose something far more effective for a room full of rank and nerves. Composure. She received the household in the front sitting room before noon, dressed in dove-gray silk, with her hands folded loosely in her lap, as if she were about to discuss lace, not accusation. Don Balthazar stood near the window. Doña Mercedes sat straight-backed with her embroidery untouched. Gaspar kept to the wall. The notary had not yet opened his case, but he was there, ink already on his fingers. Adela was called in last. The room smelled of starch, candle wax, and the faint, bitter trace of chocolate cooling in a silver cup. Inés lifted her eyes to her. "A devotional medal is missing from my dressing table." Adela stood still. "I have not seen it, Signora," she said. The answer was simple. That made it dangerous. Falsehood likes complication. Truth often arrives plainly and then suffers for its manners. Inés tilted her head a fraction. "You were in my chamber last night?" "Yes, Signora." "And no one else entered after you?" Doña Mercedes moved her gaze toward the floor. Don Balthazar said nothing. Tomás, standing near the doorway, felt the full ugliness of the trap at once. It was about timing, witnesses, and the notary waiting in the same house where sale papers would soon be drawn. If Adela could be marked as untrustworthy before transfer, the removal would seem prudent instead of convenient. "You searched her things?" Tomás asked. Gaspar stepped forward. "At your father's instruction, Don Tomás." "And?" Gaspar hesitated. "Nothing was found." That should have ended it. It did not. Inés gave the smallest of smiles, one that never reached her eyes. "The cleverest servants do not keep what they take." There are moments when a room reveals itself more honestly than any confession could. Don Balthazar's silence said scandal matters more than fairness. Gaspar's posture said authority will side with whoever signs his wages. The notary's lowered gaze said respectable men can watch almost anything if it is wrapped in domestic language. Tomás, hearing all this, understood that neutrality had finally become indistinguishable from participation. Adela looked at him only once. She did not plead. She did not seek rescue in that glance. She was simply measuring whether this would be another one of those hours when he suffered inwardly and let the world proceed. That was the worst part. She knew him well enough now to ask nothing. Inés rose, her skirts whispered over the floor. "A lesson may still be useful, even when proof is lacking." She stepped toward Adela with the kind of calm that makes everyone else in the room complicit before a hand is even raised. Tomás felt something break inside him then, not in the grand way ballads lie about, but in the ordinary, irreversible way a man's last excuse collapses when the cost of keeping it becomes a face he can no longer bear to watch. Inés lifted her hand. From the doorway, before anyone else could move or breathe or pretend not to see, Tomás said her name in a voice the house had never heard from him before. The room changed at the sound of his voice. Inés stopped with her hand lifted in the air. Everyone else seemed to stop with her. Even the candle flames along the wall looked briefly still. their light caught in silver, in polished wood, in the notary's open ink case. Thomas stepped forward from the doorway and crossed the floor with a steadiness no one in that house had ever seen from him where family was concerned. "Enough," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The force of it came from the fact that it had finally arrived. Ines lowered her hand very slowly. "You forget yourself?" "No," Thomas said. "I remember myself too late." That line landed hardest on his mother. Doña Mercedes closed her eyes for a moment, as if a long-held breath had finally found a place to go. Don Balthazar's face darkened at once from the deeper offense of witnessing disorder in public. Ines turned toward the others with a look of injured dignity so practiced it might have been embroidered into her sleeves. "A medal is missing from my table. She was the last in my rooms. The search found nothing, yes, but we both know what clever servants are capable of." Thomas looked at her then in a way he never had before, as a man who had finally grown tired of calling cruelty by polite names. "I know what fear is capable of," he said, "and what humiliation can look like when it dresses itself as order." The silence after that was so deep that the scratch of the notary's sleeve against the chair sounded loud. Don Balthazar stepped in at last. "You will not speak to your wife in that tone before witnesses." Thomas did not look away from Ines. "Then perhaps witnesses are exactly what we have needed." Gaspar shifted near the wall. The notary lowered his eyes, but did not leave. Adela stood where she had been placed, hands at her sides, face composed. And in all that room, she alone did not seem surprised. Not because she had expected courage, because she had spent too long living inside the shape of his cowardice to mistake one brave moment for a miracle. Ines drew herself up. "If you mean to defend her, do so honestly. Say what everyone in this room has already begun to suspect." There it was. The thing no one had dared speak aloud. Thomas felt the floor under his boots, the heat in the room, the weight of his father's name behind him, the years of obedience pressing at his back like hands. He also felt Adela's silence, and the grave on the slope beyond the chapel, and his mother's words in the chapel passage. Feeling is not rare. Action is. So he chose. "There will be no sale," he said first, turning now to his father. "No papers for her. Not today. Not ever. By my consent." Don Balthazar's mouth opened in disbelief. Thomas went on before the old man could speak. "And if the peace of this house depends on false accusations and a woman being struck before witnesses, then the fault is not hers. It is ours." He drew one breath. Then the next one cost him more. "I will not continue this marriage." The room seemed to tilt. Ines went white. Don Balthazar took one step forward. The notary's hand froze above the page. Doña Mercedes stared at her son as if seeing him for the first time in years. And Adela, hearing those words at last, did not move toward him. She only looked at him across the room, calm and unreadable, as if the question that mattered now had nothing to do with what he had finally done, and everything to do with what she would choose next. What happened after that did cost them, exactly as it should have. Ines left the sitting room first, white with rage and dignity held together by force alone. She did not weep before witnesses. She returned to Puebla within the season, with her trunks, her maid, and a silence so cold that even Gaspar stopped trying to guess what story she would carry back to her family. Don Balthazar did not forgive his son. For 3 months, he spoke to him only through ledgers, instructions, and the clipped necessities of the estate. Yet the sale never took place. The notary's papers remained unsigned. Doña Mercedes saw to that as carefully as she had once tended the herbs at dawn, placing one obstacle after another in the path of haste until the moment of danger had passed. Thomas did not make a spectacle of repentance after that day. Perhaps at last he understood that the loudest sorrow often belongs to those who have paid the least. Instead, he did the plain work that should have come earlier. He used his own money to settle the price that still hung over Adela in his father's books, not as a gift wrapped in romance, and not as another claim. He put the sum down in the office under his father's eye, jaw tight, hands steady, and said only, "Her life will not sit in your accounts any longer." Don Balthasar signed because Prophet still spoke the language he understood best. When the paper was recorded in town, everyone expected Adela to leave. The Shu family would have taken her. Doña Mercedes made certain she knew it. She had choices now, a rarity so large it almost frightened her more than bondage had. She could go to the mill. She could ask the priest for passage farther south. She could remain nowhere near the hacienda at all. For 2 days, she walked the edges of the property when her work was done, past the dry corn rows, past the wash stones, past the chapel wall where Jacinta lay under the earth with that hidden seed. On the 3rd morning, before sunrise, she stood by that grave while the ground still held the night's cold. A green shoot, thin as a pin and pale with first life, had pushed up through the soil where no one in Oaxaca had planted anything they recognized. Small, fragile, alive anyway. When Tomas found her there, he did not stand too close. "I won't ask you to stay," he said. Adela looked at the little blade in the dirt before answering. "Good." That one word might have wounded him once. This time he accepted it for what it was. Respect, at last. Then she turned toward him, simply clear. "I will stay for a while," she said, "because I choose where my feet stand now." He lowered his head, and in that gesture there was more honor than in all his earlier tenderness kept in the shadows. Some things do not become true when spoken beautifully. They become true when someone finally bears the weight of them, in daylight. The sun rose slowly over the valley, touching the adobe walls, the laurel leaves, the rough chapel stones. Beside the grave, the first green thing from a lost country held its place in the red earth. If this story stayed with you, stay with the channel too. Leave a like, subscribe, and come back for the next long story with me.